Before I start on my lecture, I think I should just say very briefly a more personal word. I've been here at Heythrop full-time 20 years, part-time another 10 years before that. And it's been a very happy place to be. The size of the college, the particular spirit, I think, of mutual support and good humour that derives a lot from the Jesuit character of the college and the contribution of religious generally. Yes, for a time I was very busy with administration and lots of teaching, but that steadily diminished over the last few years. John McDade would come and see me and say, "Now, I know you want to concentrate on your research, so I've decided you need no longer be chair of that committee." And I've always wondered, is he really keen on my research, or was there some other reason? But actually, I am very grateful that now I am ready to concentrate on my present big project, which is producing an English translation and commentary of the voluminous Acts proceedings of early ecumenical councils. A thing that has made this possible is also the library of this college. The fact that all the primary texts I need just about are here, available in the library. All the books I need every week are here available for me. So, even when the library is closed, I can happily continue on my favourite occupations of reading these little red texts, it must be said. Well, the task of my lecture is to persuade you these texts are worth reading. So, let's begin. The human side, compared to what, you may ask? The animal side? References to animals in early church acts are rare enough. I remember nothing comparable to the bishop at the First Vatican Council, who, on hearing that the day had come round when by tradition the Pope blessed animals, suggested that while he was about it, he might as well bless the bishops at the same time, since they are just as stupid. No, I mean the human side compared to the divine side. Readers of the Conciliar Acts might ask with equal justice where that is to be found. But in retrospect, the great councils took on a numinous aspect. In the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian wished to revise some of the decisions made over persons at the Council of Chalcedon a century earlier. There were howls of protest in the West. To quote Deacon Ferrandus, the eloquent spokesman for the Church of Carthage, "If there is disapproval of any part of the Council of Chalcedon, the approval of the whole is in danger of becoming disapproval. But the whole Council of Chalcedon, since the whole of it is the Council of Chalcedon, is true. No part of it is open to criticism. Whatever we know to have been uttered, transacted, decreed, and confirmed there was worked by the ineffable and secret power of the Holy Spirit." He went on to assert, "General councils hold a place of authority second only to the Scriptures." Justinian replied that it was absurd to attribute authority to everything recorded in Conciliar Acts, since this includes statements by heretics quoted in condemnation. It is extraordinary that this obvious point needed to be made. The answer, surely, was that if remarks by Jezebel and King Herod deserve a place in Holy Writ, so do statements by heresiarchs in Conciliar Acts. Yes, let us concede that the great councils were guided in all their proceedings by the deity. This found concrete expression in the decree passed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 that condemned and deposed Dioscorus of Alexandria. The decree was not popular, and half of the bishops absented themselves from his trial. A 6th century Roman scholar, Rusticus, found in church archives at Constantinople the original text of the decree and made a note of the list of signatories. The senior bishops present at the council were the 3 Roman delegates, who come in the list at numbers 6 to 8. Senior to them at number 5 is Pope Leo the Great, present in his delegates. Senior to him at number 4 is St. Peter. And senior to St. Peter at numbers 1 to 3 are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is unusual for the three persons of the Holy Trinity to be mustered into service to lengthen a list. But even here, there was no suggestion that the members of the Trinity actually signed the decree themselves, like the hand of God writing on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. Divine guidance worked at councils through secondary causes. It was the bishops, without visible aid, who proposed, spoke, and voted, and this left plenty of scope for human initiative and human bungling. Do I use the term human too broadly? Large categories of the human race have next to no place in conciliar acts. Children, of course, are absent, but so virtually are women. An exception that proves the rule was the 6th session of Chalcedon on the 25th of October, 451, a gala occasion at which the new definition of the faith was solemnly read out and proclaimed in the presence of the emperors, Marcian and his spouse, Pulcheria. On the sudden death of her brother, Theodosius II, in the previous year, Pulcheria, who had enjoyed the title of Augusta or Empress since 414, gave legitimacy to the new regime by going through a form of marriage with the new emperor Marcian, and took personal charge of ecclesiastical policy, totally reversing its course. This was no new interest. A story circulated that when Nestorius arrived at Constantinople as the new bishop back in 428, she presented herself for Easter communion within the sanctuary of the cathedral. When Nestorius told her curtly to get out, she is supposed to have replied, "You cannot drive me out, for have I not given birth to God?" meaning spiritually within her soul. But in fact, 4 years later, one of the agents of the Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, Nestorius's great opponent, lamented that Pulcheria still showed no enthusiasm for the Orthodox cause, despite having received many blessings, a euphemism for bribes. So the story of her contretemps with Nestorius must be dismissed as fiction. Still, her dominant role in the church politics in 450-1 need not be doubted. Her appearance at Chalcedon was right and proper, and the bishops acclaimed her as the new Helena. But when the complete acts or proceedings of this session of the council came to be published, her name was deleted from the attendance list. The reason, we may surmise, was that critics of the council were comparing her role in the condemnation of Dioscorus, whom the council deposed, to that of Herodias in the beheading of John the Baptist. Yes, councils were all male affairs, but not merely because they were councils of bishops. Laymen, too, had a role. The title ecumenical, or worldwide, accorded to the great councils of late antiquity, depended not on attendance by bishops from the entire Christian world, something that was neither achieved nor even attempted, but on convocation by the emperor, who was believed to be God's viceroy throughout the world, even if much of the world failed to recognize him. The same claim was still being made by the Byzantine emperor at the time of the Council of Florence in the 15th century, even though his territory by then had been reduced to the largely derelict city of Constantinople and its immediate hinterland. Yes, ecumenical councils were by definition councils summoned by the emperor. Surely then emperors had every right to attend them. In the Catholic Church, the matter received authoritative treatment in the longest and most learned work ever devoted to conciliar procedure, the Treatise De Concilio by Cardinal Jacobatius, written at the behest of Pope Paul III in preparation for the Council of Trent, and published in 1538. Jacobatius states that rulers, and supremely the Holy Roman Emperor, ought to be invited, since he is the advocate of the Church and the defender of the laity. And as he argues, the laity have a right to be represented at councils that defines matters of doctrine, since doctrine is of concern to the laity, and not only to clerics. It is striking that Jacobatius's work, so alien to the presumptions of ultramontanism, was reprinted by the Vatican itself in 1870, at the time of the First Vatican Council. We have seen that Marcion and Pulcheria put in an appearance at Chalcedon, and when emperors appeared at councils, they automatically replaced the chairman. The Emperor Constantine the Great put in appearances at the First Ecumenical Council, that of Nicaea in 325. Eusebius, the famous church historian and an eyewitness, gives a highly colored account of his attendance at the solemn opening. All arose at a signal which announced the emperor's entrance, and he finally walked along between them like some heavenly angel of God, his bright mantle shedding luster like beams of light, shining with the fiery radiance of a purple robe. Such was his physical appearance. As for his soul, he was visibly adorned with fear and reverence for God. This was shown by his eyes, which were cast down, the blush on his face, his gait, and the rest of his appearance, which surpassed all those around him by his dignified maturity, the magnificence of his physical condition, and the vigor of his matchless strength. After Constantine had taken his seat and the bishops after him, one of them welcomed Constantine in a speech in flowery prose, to which Constantine replied in Latin. But it is another source, the 5th century historian Socrates, who adds the most significant detail. Constantine produced a sheaf of petitions that bishops had presented to him the day before, accusing one another of various crimes and heresies, and ordered them to be burnt. Sadly, this lesson to the bishops on the need to put up with one another fell on deaf ears, and the council became acrimonious. It used to be presumed that Constantine acted as chairman through much of the council, but this is unlikely, for the same reason that Queen Elizabeth is not the chairman of the Anglican Synod. It would be beneath her dignity. What did emperors think of councils? Just before the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine learnt that the Eastern bishops were fiercely divided on the subject of Arianism, with its denial of the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son, he sent a letter to the leading disputants in the following terms. With disputes of this kind, which no necessity of any law demands, but are promoted by argument in unprofitable idleness, even if they take place as some sort of gymnastic exercise, still it is our duty to shut them up inside the mind and not casually produce them at synods. You surely know that even the philosophers themselves all agree on one set of principles, and often when they disagree in some part of their statements, yet they agree together in unity when it comes to basic principle. Let us consider whether it is right that through a few futile verbal quarrels between you, brothers are set against brothers, and the godly synod divided in ungodly variance through us, when we quarrel with each other over such small and utterly unimportant matters. It is a matter of opinion whether this dismissal of the Arian controversy displayed common sense or theological illiteracy, or indeed both. In 431, Theodosius II summoned the First Council of Ephesus with a similar purpose to restore peace to the Church after accusations of heresy had got out of hand. Hundreds of bishops dutifully made their way to Ephesus, but they never met together in a single body, and indeed such a gathering would have been pandemonium. Councils were chaired in consort by the senior bishops present, but how on this occasion would this have been possible? For the Bishop of Alexandria had accused the Bishop of Constantinople of heresy, while the Bishop of Antioch had made the same charge against the Bishop of Alexandria. There was no senior bishop acceptable to all as chairman, and how could a board of chairmen operate when several of them were themselves under accusation? Predictably, therefore, the bishops refused to meet under one roof. But the emperor refused to take the dispute seriously. In his eyes, the bishops were behaving like quarrelsome children. He thought it sufficient to tell them to behave, to meet together to discuss the faith calmly and with decorum, and produce a common statement of faith. Episcopal principle was as incomprehensible to him as episcopal acrimony. After 3 months, he gave up and dissolved the council. At Chalcedon, 20 years later, the emperor avoided this danger by appointing a panel of senior government officials to chair and dominate the proceedings. At the beginning of the 12th session, the principal lay chairman, the patrician Anatolius, castigated the bishops for wasting the time of him and his colleagues. The attention to public business necessary for the state is being neglected as a result of our having been ordered by the divine head to attend the council continually in this way for the sake of the faith. Since it is not possible for us to be dragged away from affairs necessary to the state for long, we are anxious that the inquiries should receive a speedy resolution. In the eyes of government, clearly, church affairs were not a first priority. Anatolius was not at this date holding any particular government office, but doubtless he had fingers in many pies and thought he had better ways of spending his time than adjudicating clerical disputes. But the position gradually changed. By the end of the 7th century, at a low point in the history of the Byzantine state, the emperor was in control only of Constantinople and of parts of the Balkans and Anatolia, while church affairs were of prime importance in securing good relations with the Latin West. In consequence, Constantine IV not only summoned a new ecumenical council to restore good relations with Rome, but actually chaired a good half of the sessions in person. The only real ecumenical council by ancient standards after the 8th century was that of Ferrara, Florence in the mid-15th, attended throughout by the Byzantine Emperor John VIII. The question of precedence between him and the Pope loomed large. The Latins insisted not only that the Pope and not the Emperor should chair the council, but that the Emperor's seat should be located beneath that of the Pope, exactly opposite the seat reserved for the Holy Roman Emperor from Germany. John objected that the German emperor was an irrelevance, since he was not present and at this particular juncture did not even exist, but he had to give way. It was a bad omen when the Council of Ferrara, called to mend the great schism between East and West, began with a disgruntled emperor and an equally disgruntled Patriarch of Constantinople, though his reason for offense was even more trivial. His throne had not been provided with a canopy. Humbler laymen did not attend the great ecumenical councils, but they had a role in the suites of the bishops. Both Cyril of Alexandria and Nestorius of Constantinople arrived for the Council of Ephesus with a large contingent of faithful followers. Those with Cyril were the so-called parabolani, supposedly sick nurses and hospital orderlies, but in fact a gang of heavies whom Cyril used at Ephesus to impress orthodox doctrine on those bishops who were not amenable to theological argument. Nestorius had his own supply of similar assistants, drawn from the masseurs and chuckers out at the largest and roughest of the public baths of Constantinople. Councils remained, of course, assemblies of bishops, but this did not exclude a role for junior clergy. Many priests and other clerics attended and are likely to have outnumbered the bishops. Some of them came as representatives of absent bishops, with the right to speak and vote on their behalf. The Council of Ferrara, Florence, 439 to 45, was attended by a Greek cleric who had been chosen some time before to represent the Patriarch of Alexandria. In the meantime, he was made a bishop with the titular see of Ephesus. Then at the council, the list was revised, and he was nominated to represent the Patriarch of Antioch. He was utterly furious at what he regarded as demotion, since Antioch ranked after Alexandria. The cup of his bitterness was filled when a mere monk was chosen in his place to represent Alexandria. But even if monks and priests were recognized presence at councils, woe betide them if they put up opposition to the bishops. During the Council of Chalcedon, a number of monks in Constantinople appealed to the emperor over the rough treatment they had received from their bishop Anatolius. The emperor sent them along to the council. The following episode ensued. I quote from the Conciliar Acts. There entered Croesus, Dorotheus, and the rest of the most devout monks mentioned above. The most magnificent and glorious officials and the exalted Senate, meaning the lay chairman, said, "Your reverences earlier presented a petition to the victorious head, so look at the petition that is being shown to you and say if you recognize it as the one you presented." Croesus and the other petitioners said, "This is the petition we presented." The most magnificent and glorious officials and the exalted Senate said, "Let the petition be read." Before the reading, however, Anatolius, the most devout Archbishop of Constantinople, said, "Calapodius and Gerontius, who are the presbyters among them, were deposed some time ago. They are not permitted to enter." Gerontius and Calapodius said, "No one told us we were deposed. This is the first we have heard of it." Aetius, archdeacon of the Holy Church of Constantinople, went up to Calapodius and said to him, "The archbishop tells you, through me the archdeacon, that you are deposed. Get out!" Anatolius's methods were brutal. A more feline approach had been adopted by his predecessor Flavian, when chairing 3 years before the synod that tried and condemned the archimandrite Eutyches. Eutyches was summoned to the synod, but resisted the summons, claiming ill health and a vow never to leave his monastery. At the council, Flavian reacted with touching solicitude. "Let him come here. He will come to fathers and brothers, to people who are not ignorant of him, and who even now persevere in friendship. We are human beings, and many of the great have been led into error and deceived through imprudence and inexperience. It is not repentance that brings shame. What brings disgrace is persisting in the wrong. Let him come here, and when he confesses and anathematizes his errors, we will pardon him for the past." Yet at the very next session, Flavian assured Eutyches' accusers that he would not escape conviction by adopting orthodoxy. And when the patrician Florentius, a senior government official, expressed a wish to attend the synod, Flavian told him not to bother, since he already had Eutyches' condemnation signed and sealed in his pocket. Unfortunately, as it turned out, Florentius did attend the final session, at which Eutyches finally put in an appearance, only to find his profession of orthodoxy brushed aside and heavy pressure applied to him to adopt Flavian's version of orthodoxy. Florentius joined in the hunt and told Eutyches that he had to accept the doctrine of two natures in Christ. However, 6 months later, a cold breeze blew from the palace against the hounding of Eutyches, who now accused Flavian of having falsified the minutes of the synod. A public investigation was held in which the minutes were read out, and Florentius attempted to deny his injudicious intervention. To quote his own words, "I did not say this. I could not possibly have said it, for I was not able as a layman to lay down doctrine." At this, Flavian turned to the unfortunate secretaries and pointed out that they were now under accusation of falsifying the record. The chief notary replied gently, "There is something I could say to that." But the bishops, of course, were the main actors at councils. What motivated them? Unsympathetic observers accused them of an obsession with the material benefits of office. The historian Ammianus, a pagan but a fair-minded one, has left us a vivid account of the veritable battle that was fought in Rome in 366, with hundreds of corpses in the churches between two rival candidates for the papacy, and concludes, "Bearing in mind the ostentation in city life, I do not deny that those who covet such a thing ought to exert all their energy to attain what they desire. For when they attain it, they will be so free from care as to be enriched by noble ladies, ride in carriages, wear elaborate robes, and serve banquets more lavish than the tables of kings. But these men could be truly happy if they would disregard the greatness of the city and live like some provincial bishops, whose moderation in food and drink, plain dress, and eyes fixed humbly on the ground commend them to the eternal deity and his true worshippers." Yet it would be unjust to treat the doctrinal disputes as mere exercises in episcopal self-interest. Nothing is more impressive in the career of Cyril of Alexandria than his readiness to sacrifice the fabled wealth of his church in order to advance the cause of orthodoxy. Some of his clergy were appalled by the way he stripped bare the churches of his city in order to provide the wherewithal for sending blessings to those with influence at the court of Constantinople. The same Rusticus, whose exploration of the archives of the capital I mentioned earlier on, came across a document that gives a list of recipients of Cyril's generosity. One of the entries lists the blessings bestowed on the head eunuch of the imperial bedchamber. "To Chryseros, so that he should cease to oppose us, we have been forced to send double the usual amount. 6 large thick carpets, 4 medium thick carpets, 4 large standard carpets, 8 dining couches, 6 tablecloths, 6 large woven hangings, 6 medium hangings, 6 stool covers, 12 for chairs, 4 large tapestries, 4 ivory chairs, 4 ivory stools, 6 benches, 4 large tables, and 6 ostriches, presumably in silver as table decorations. And if he helps us, 200 pounds of gold." If bishops, or at least some of them, could contribute ostriches in silver and pounds of gold to influence the doctrinal debate, how competent were they in dealing with the intricate niceties of doctrinal analysis? A curious situation arose in Rome in the 640s. Maximus the Confessor and other monks from Palestine arrived as refugees fleeing from the Muslim conquest and persuaded Pope Theodore that the Byzantine Church, through its support of the doctrine that there is but one will in Christ, had fallen into the heresy of monothelitism. It was decided that the best way to restore orthodoxy was to hold a council in Rome, which would issue proceedings that combine full conciliar authority with a convincing statement of the anti-monothelite, that is, the diothelite position. Substantial florilegia were compiled of passages showing that the Orthodox fathers had been diothelite, accompanied by florilegia filled out with fictitious passages showing that the great heretics of the past had been monothelite. But the problem was that these Florilegia were far from compelling. They needed to be supplemented by detailed argumentation. Now, the Pope and the Italian bishops were not up to this. Indeed, at councils, bishops were expected to discern the truth, but not to play at being theologians. The solution adopted was for Maximus and his team to compose the speeches required, which they did in Greek, and for these to be translated into Latin and inserted in the Acts of the Council that was duly held under the chairmanship of Theodore's successor, Pope Martin, in 649. What actually happened at the sessions? Rudolf Riedinger, the author of the critical edition of the Acts, supposed that the proceedings had been fully composed before the council even met, and that the bishops simply listened to a reading of this fictitious document and added their signatures. An Italian scholar has suggested more plausibly that the Acts provided a script that the bishops read from. It seems to me more likely that the speeches were never read out at all. A pleasing touch in the Acts is that the Greek monks put in an appearance at one of the sessions and requested that the Acts be translated into Greek, although in fact the Greek version was the original one and they had themselves composed it. The metropolitan bishops with sees that were also provincial capitals were the star performers at councils. In contrast, their suffragans were lobby fodder. The typical procedure, once a matter had been put before the council, was for the leading metropolitans to carry out a discussion and reach a common mind. At this point, all the bishops could then be asked to state their opinion, now that it was clear to them what opinion they were required to express. And after a vote of this kind, they all had to sign the acts of the session. Abstention, still less dissent, was not permitted. During the doctrinal debates at the Council of Chalcedon, the boldest voice for the opposition, after the deposition of Dioscorus, was Bishop Amphilochius of Sidon in Anatolia. Even he signed the definition when placed before him, after he had been struck on the head by the Archdeacon of Constantinople. A few bishops were illiterate, as was shown by others signing for them. The bishops attending the great councils were overwhelmingly from the eastern provinces of the empire. Very few of them, therefore, could understand Latin, though it was still the language of the secular administration, but almost all of them could speak Greek, even those from regions such as Syria and much of Anatolia and Syria, where Greek was not the first language. But to say that they could speak Greek is not to say that all of them spoke it perfectly, as may be illustrated from the minutes of the opening session of the First Council of Ephesus in 431. The bishops found themselves required, each in turn, to express judgment on the second letter of Cyril of Alexandria to Nestorius. Cyril was chairing the session, and their verdicts were wholly predictable. But Cyril was under accusation, and he wanted all the bishops present to commit themselves to his cause. 200 bishops duly did so, but not all of them with equal felicity. It was not acceptable for a bishop simply to say, "I agree," or to repeat verbatim the words of a colleague who had already spoken. Bishop Spudasius of Keramus in Caria came out with the following. "In the faith expounded by the Holy Fathers assembled at Nicaea, I have lived and vow to live. Likewise, seeing that the letter written by our father, the most holy Archbishop Cyril, to the most religious Bishop Nestorius is homonymous, I accept it and find it in no way differing from the creed. Therefore, I too believe and confirm both of them." Delightful is the episcopal malapropism by which he calls the letter homonymous with the creed, which means identical in wording but quite different in meaning. When what he meant, of course, was synonymous. There was a similar infelicity in the words of Bishop Thebammon from Egypt, whose first language will not have been Greek. The letter just read by our Father, the Most Holy Cyril, has the same meaning as the doctrines expounded by the Council of Nicaea and differs in no respect and provides a correction of the orthodox doctrines. Clearly, by correction, he meant confirmation. How similar these little words are. As I've said, after a case had been discussed in a council and the chairman, in the light of the discussion, had given his verdict, dissent was not permitted. This could lead to problems if the chairman was nodding. A notorious case with near disastrous consequences occurred at the Council of Chalcedon, when the deposed Bishop Ebas of Edessa presented an appeal for reinstatement. Since the council that had deposed him, the so-called robber council of Ephesus, was in deep disgrace, his reinstatement was certain. But the council felt obliged to give a hearing to the charges that had been brought against him. 10th in the list on the charge sheet was the following sad and vivid tale. At a commemoration of the holy martyrs, no wine was provided to be offered in the holy sanctuary, consecrated and distributed to the people, except for a very small amount of poor quality, full of dregs and only just harvested, with the result that those appointed to minister were obliged to buy wine of poor quality from a tavern, 6 pints of it, and even this was not enough. Meanwhile, in the sacristy, the senior clergy were drinking and had kept for themselves, as they always do, a quite different wine of superlative quality. The one in charge of the ministers, though he's told about it so that he could give a frank report to the bishop, did nothing, and so it fell to us to inform the most devout bishop, who, however, so far from being stirred into action by our report, paid no attention, with the result that many in our city were scandalized. The really important charge came next and is almost perfunctory in its brevity. Ebas is an historian and calls the blessed Bishop Cyril a heretic. In the course of this hearing at Chalcedon, a letter was read out that Ebas had written almost 20 years before, soon after the First Council of Ephesus, in which he severely criticized both the council and its dominating chairman, Cyril of Alexandria. This letter was an acute embarrassment at Chalcedon, where most of the bishops hugely revered Cyril's memory. It fell to Pascasinus, a bishop from Sicily, who was the senior papal legate, to deliver the first and decisive verdict. Inevitably, he ruled in favor of the reinstatement of Ebas in the See of Edessa, but unfortunately he added the words, and from the reading of his letter we have found him to be orthodox. We can only suppose that he had failed to grasp the contents of the letter. His Greek was limited, he always spoke Latin himself, and his attention may well have been wandering during the reading of some lengthy documents which were not going to have any effect on the outcome. But conciliar etiquette imposed a requirement of unanimity. This made it impossible for the bishops who spoke after him to express disagreement. Bishop Maximus of Antioch actually repeated his commendation of the letter, not out of conviction, for he was firmly in the Cyrillian camp, but because his tenure of his own see was insecure and depended on papal support. The other bishops, as they delivered their verdicts, wisely omitted all reference to the letter. A century later, Pascasinus's and Maximus's praise of the letter became a major problem, when the 3 chapters, one of which was the same letter from Ebas, were condemned by both the Emperor Justinian and the Second Council of Constantinople, crowning a controversy of which Gibbon said that it has received more volumes than it deserved lines. Justinian argued that the approval of the letter by a mere 2 bishops at Chalcedon had not committed the whole council. But the seniority of Pascasinus as papal legate made it impossible to dismiss his verdict so lightly. Instead, a more desperate remedy was soon adopted. It was claimed that Pascasinus and Maximus had not been referring to this letter at all, but to another document read out at this session, a testimonial in Ebas's support that he had forced 65 of his clergy to sign, which could surely be called Ebas's letter in a weaker sense of the phrase. And surely Pascasinus must have been praising not the letter that disgraced Ebas, but the one that exonerated him. But if Pascasinus had not been referring to Ebas's shocking letter, this left the other bishops with no excuse for failing to speak out against it. Critics of Chalcedon cited this episode as evidence that the council had been tolerant of attacks on Cyril of Alexandria, who by the 6th century was universally acclaimed as a supreme exponent of the doctrine about Christ. This was the Achilles heel in the attempt by Justinian to persuade the many anti-Chalcedonian Christians that their devotion to the memory of Cyril was perfectly compatible with accepting the council. In all, the convention by which the verdicts of chairmen had to be confirmed and could never be criticized simplified matters in the short term, but in the long term was a recipe for potential disaster. In this case, an inattentive chairman marred the memory of the greatest of the councils. I must draw my words to a close. What do I want you to conclude from this mass of edifying anecdotes? Nothing, of course. But they do provide an answer to a question once put to me by a learned colleague in an older university. Didn't you find the Acts of Chalcedon terribly boring to translate? I replied that some portions tested the patience even of a pedant like myself, such as the 160 verdicts in the Acts on the orthodoxy of the tome of Pope Leo, all of which say the same thing in slightly different words. But many more parts of Conciliar Acts, of which I have by now translated some 750,000 words, have engaged my interest, either because they are as revealing as the ones I have cited this evening, or because the very absence of contention, the very smoothness of the proceedings raise questions about the authenticity of the record and the methods of its compilation. I hope that others will follow me, and that neglected volumes of Conciliar Acts will be dusted down and read again for the divine illumination and human entertainment that they so richly provide.